When we talk about stop doing these if you want to earn her respect, what we're really addressing is something I've seen come up again and again in human behavior and relationships. The small habits, reactions, and emotional patterns that quietly destroy respect long before love even has a chance to grow deeper. And I want to welcome you to this space, because this isn't about blaming men or turning relationships into a game of control. It's about understanding how respect is actually built, and more importantly, how it is lost without most people even noticing it. Over time, through conversations and real-life patterns I've observed in people navigating relationships, one thing has become painfully clear. Respect is rarely lost in one big moment. It's lost in the repeated small things you think don't matter. The way you respond when you're ignored, the way you try too hard to be chosen, the way you adjust your personality just to avoid conflict. These things slowly shift how you are perceived, not because you are less, but because consistency and self-respect is what shapes how others treat you. And here's where it gets controversial for some people. Attraction and respect don't always respond well to over-effort. In fact, when someone constantly over-explains themselves, over-chases attention, or abandons their own standards just to maintain peace, what often gets communicated is not love or loyalty, but uncertainty in self-value. I've seen people confuse emotional availability with emotional dependency, and that confusion is where things start to fall apart. So in this video, we're going to break down the specific behaviors that silently reduce respect in relationships, especially the ones most people don't even realize they're doing. This is not about becoming cold or distant. It's about becoming aware of what strengthens your presence and what weakens it. And once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. 1. Over-explaining yourself in every situation. When I talk about over-explaining yourself in every situation, I'm referring to a pattern I've seen repeatedly in people who genuinely want to be understood, but slowly end up losing their sense of presence in the process. It usually starts in a very innocent way. You meet someone you care about, you want things to go smoothly, and when misunderstandings happen, you feel the need to explain everything in detail so there's no room for doubt. At first, it feels responsible, even mature. You think if you just say enough, clarify enough, and justify your intentions clearly enough, the other person will finally see your heart the way you intend it. But over time, something shifts. Instead of your words being received as clarity, they begin to sound like uncertainty. Instead of confidence, what starts coming through is a quiet need for approval. In my experience observing people in relationships, I've seen this pattern create emotional imbalance, where one person begins to feel like they are constantly being convinced rather than simply communicated with. And here's the subtle part most people miss. Respect doesn't just come from what you say, it also comes from how much you trust that what you said is enough. When you over-explain, especially in emotional moments, you unintentionally signal that your initial word carries no weight unless it is heavily defended. I remember working with individuals who would replay conversations in their mind endlessly, feeling the urge to send just one more message to make sure they were not misunderstood, only to realize later that the more they tried to fix perception, the more unstable they appeared emotionally. And this isn't about silence or becoming distant. It's about learning that not every misunderstanding requires a full courtroom defense of your intentions. Sometimes clarity is already enough, but anxiety convinces you otherwise. What makes this even more impactful in relationships is that the other person begins to adjust to your pattern. They start expecting explanations instead of trusting your boundaries or your initial communication. Slowly, the dynamic shifts where you become someone who always has to prove what you meant, rather than someone whose words naturally stand on their own. I've seen people lose a quiet form of respect, not because they did something wrong, but because they constantly acted like they needed to correct how they were perceived. And the truth is, when you are secure in yourself, you don't feel the need to chase understanding from every angle. You allow space for people to interpret, reflect, and even misunderstand sometimes without rushing to fix everything immediately. That inner calm communicates more strength than any explanation ever could. 2. Chasing attention instead of valuing your presence. When I talk about chasing attention instead of valuing your presence, I'm describing a behavior pattern I've seen weaken relationships from the inside out, especially in people who don't realize they've started negotiating their worth for small moments of attention. It usually doesn't begin in an obvious way. It starts subtly, almost like a habit you think is harmless. You send the extra message just to stay on her mind. You try to say the perfect thing so she replies faster. You become slightly more available than you actually want to be, just so there's no gap where silence could make you feel replaceable. In the beginning, it feels like effort, like you're being intentional, but over time, that effort slowly turns into dependency on how she responds to you, and that is where things begin to shift. In my experience working with people navigating relationships, I've seen that the moment attention becomes something you chase rather than something you naturally receive, your emotional balance starts to tilt. You stop asking yourself, "Am I showing up as myself?" and instead start asking, "What do I need to do to get her attention right now?" That shift might seem small, but it changes the entire dynamic of how you are perceived. Because presence is not about how often you reach out, it's about the weight your presence carries when you are not trying to be noticed. I've observed situations where men begin to overinvest emotionally early on, constantly checking for replies, rereading conversations, or adjusting their tone depending on how quickly she responds. And without realizing it, they start building their emotional state around her attention patterns. If she replies fast, they feel important. If she delays, they feel uncertain. That kind of emotional dependency is not attractive in the long term because it removes the sense of grounded self-assurance that naturally builds respect in interactions. What many don't understand is that attention, when chased, loses its value in the eyes of the other person because it begins to feel expected rather than earned. And when something feels expected, it stops feeling special. I've had conversations where people told me they felt like they were doing everything right, but still felt overlooked. And when we broke it down, the issue wasn't effort, it was emotional positioning. They had placed themselves in a role where their energy was always reaching outward, never centered within themselves. The shift that changes everything is learning to exist without constantly needing confirmation that you are being seen. When you are grounded in your own presence, your communication becomes cleaner, your timing becomes natural, and your emotional state is no longer controlled by someone else's responsiveness. You stop performing for attention and start expressing from stability. And ironically, that is often when attention begins to return in a healthier way, not because you chased it, but because your presence no longer feels like something trying to be noticed. It simply is. 3. Ignoring your own boundaries to avoid conflict. When I talk about ignoring your own boundaries to avoid conflict, I'm referring to one of the most common patterns I've seen in relationships where a man slowly begins to disappear inside the relationship without even realizing it. It doesn't happen in one dramatic moment. It happens through small decisions where you choose temporary peace over personal truth. At first, it feels harmless. You let something slide because you don't want an argument. You agree to something you're not fully comfortable with because you want to keep the mood light. You ignore that small internal discomfort because you tell yourself it's not worth the tension. But over time, those small choices start to accumulate, and what begins as keeping the peace quietly turns into self-abandonment. In my experience observing relationship dynamics, I've seen that people don't lose respect for someone because they have boundaries. They lose respect when those boundaries are inconsistent or invisible. When you don't clearly stand on what is okay and what is not, people are left to guess your limits, and in that guessing, they often push further than you are comfortable with. And here's the part many people struggle to accept. Every time you ignore your own boundary to avoid conflict, you are actually training the other person on how to treat you. Not because they are intentionally trying to cross lines, but because human behavior naturally adjusts to what is tolerated. I've worked with individuals who later reflected on their relationships and realized they had spent so much time avoiding uncomfortable conversations that they eventually felt invisible in their own emotional space. They were present physically, but internally, they had stopped expressing what they needed. What makes this even more complex is that avoidance often feels like maturity in the moment. You tell yourself you are being understanding, flexible, or patient. But there is a difference between healthy compromise and self-erasure. Healthy compromise still includes your voice. Self-erasure removes it completely. I remember a pattern I've seen where someone would repeatedly accept things that didn't sit right with them, convincing themselves that speaking up would make them seem difficult or create distance. But instead of creating harmony, what actually developed was quiet resentment and emotional fatigue. Because unspoken boundaries don't disappear, they build pressure internally. And eventually, that pressure shows up in frustration that feels confusing even to the person experiencing it. What I often guide people toward understanding is that boundaries are not walls meant to push people away. They are structures that define emotional safety. Without them, relationships become unstable because one person is constantly adjusting while the other is never fully aware of the cost of that adjustment. When you begin to respect your own limits, you don't need to enforce them aggressively. You simply communicate them clearly and consistently. And the interesting shift that happens is that relationships become more honest. People either align with your boundaries or reveal incompatibility earlier, but either way, you stop losing yourself in the process of trying to be accepted. 4. Reacting emotionally instead of responding calmly. When I talk about reacting emotionally instead of responding calmly, I'm referring to a pattern I've seen unfold in many relationships where the real issue is not the situation itself, but how quickly emotions take over the conversation. Imagine someone in a relationship sitting in a situation where something their partner says or does triggers discomfort, jealousy, or frustration. In that moment, the natural instinct is often to react immediately, to speak without pause, to defend yourself, to correct the situation right away so the discomfort doesn't sit inside you for too long. But what I've consistently observed is that when reactions lead instead of awareness, the outcome rarely reflects the true intention behind the words. I remember situations I've seen in my work where a man feels ignored or misunderstood by his partner, and instead of slowing down to understand what he actually feels, he responds instantly with emotion. The tone becomes sharper, the message becomes heavier than intended, and suddenly the conversation shifts from the original issue into a conflict about how things were said. What started as a simple misunderstanding turns into emotional distance. And here's what most people don't realize in those moments. It's not the feeling that causes damage, it's the lack of space between feeling and expression. In relationships, emotional reactions often create temporary relief for the person expressing them, but long-term confusion for the person receiving them. Because when you react impulsively, your partner is no longer responding to your actual concern, they are responding to the intensity of your delivery. I've seen couples where one partner says something small, something that could have been clarified in a calm conversation, but the other partner reacts immediately, and that reaction sets off a chain where both people stop listening and start defending. And in that space, understanding disappears. Over time, repeated emotional reactions create an environment where conversations feel unpredictable. One moment things are fine, the next moment there is tension, not because the issue is severe, but because the emotional response escalated it. In one case I observed, a person in a relationship realized later that their partner was not actually difficult to talk to, but they themselves had created resistance by reacting too quickly to situations that needed reflection instead of immediate response. What changes everything is learning to create a pause between what you feel and what you express. That pause is not about suppressing emotion, it is about processing it before it becomes language. When someone in a relationship begins to respond instead of react, something shifts in how they are perceived. Their words carry more weight, their tone becomes more stable, and their presence feels grounded rather than unpredictable. And interestingly, the other partner begins to open up more, not because they are being controlled or managed, but because the emotional environment feels safer to communicate in. Calm responses create clarity, while emotional reactions often create confusion, even when the intention is honesty. 5. Seeking constant validation from her approval. When I talk about seeking constant validation from her approval, I'm referring to a pattern I've seen in relationships where one person slowly starts measuring their value based on how the other person reacts to them. Imagine someone in a relationship who begins to rely heavily on their partner's responses to feel secure about themselves. If she replies quickly, he feels important. If she takes longer than expected, he starts questioning what he did wrong. If she sounds excited, he feels confident. If she sounds distant, his mood shifts immediately. Over time, this creates a situation where his emotional state is no longer stable on its own. It is constantly being shaped by her reactions. In my experience observing relationship dynamics, this is one of the quietest ways self-confidence begins to weaken inside a relationship, because it doesn't look like insecurity at first, it looks like care. It looks like being attentive, invested, and emotionally involved, but underneath that surface, there is a growing need for confirmation that you are still valued. I've seen situations where a man in a relationship begins to overanalyze simple interactions, replaying conversations in his mind, wondering if he said the right thing, or if she is pulling away based on small changes in tone. Instead of standing on his own sense of worth, he starts outsourcing it to her reactions. And the problem with that is simple but powerful. No one person can consistently provide emotional stability for another person without it becoming overwhelming on both sides. What often happens in these cases is that the partner begins to feel pressure they cannot fully explain. They start to sense that their normal behavior is being monitored for emotional feedback, and that changes the natural flow of the relationship. I remember a pattern I've seen where someone would constantly seek reassurance in subtle ways, not always directly asking for it, but fishing for it through questions, messages, or emotional signals. And even when reassurance was given, it never lasted long, because the real issue was not the lack of reassurance, it was the dependency on it. The mind that depends on validation will always find a reason to question it again. What many people don't realize is that validation is not meant to be a constant supply that keeps you stable. It is meant to be a shared expression, not a foundation for self-worth. When you begin to look at your partner as the primary source of emotional confirmation, you slowly remove your own internal grounding. And in relationships, that creates imbalance, because attraction and respect are deeply influenced by emotional independence. I've seen people transform their relationships simply by shifting this pattern, not by becoming distant, but by becoming internally steady. Instead of waiting for approval, they begin to trust their own judgment. Instead of reading every response for hidden meaning, they start focusing on the actual content of communication. And over time, something interesting happens. The relationship becomes lighter, communication becomes clearer, and the emotional pressure reduces, because one person is no longer carrying the responsibility of constantly validating the other's worth. 6. Losing your personal standards just to keep her close. When I talk about seeking constant validation from her approval, I'm referring to a pattern I've seen in relationships where one person slowly starts measuring their value based on how the other person reacts to them. Imagine someone in a relationship who begins to rely heavily on their partner's responses to feel secure about themselves. If she replies quickly, he feels important. If she takes longer than expected, he starts questioning what he did wrong. If she sounds excited, he feels confident. If she sounds distant, his mood shifts immediately. Over time, this creates a situation where his emotional state is no longer stable on its own. It is constantly being shaped by her reactions. In my experience observing relationship dynamics, this is one of the quietest ways self-confidence begins to weaken inside a relationship, because it doesn't look like insecurity at first. It looks like care. It looks like being attentive, invested, and emotionally involved. But underneath that surface, there is a growing need for confirmation that you are still valued. I've seen situations where a man in a relationship begins to overanalyze simple interactions, replaying conversations in his mind, wondering if he said the right thing, or if she is pulling away based on small changes in tone. Instead of standing on his own sense of worth, he starts outsourcing it to her reactions. And the problem with that is simple but powerful. No one person can consistently provide emotional stability for another person without it becoming overwhelming on both sides. What often happens in these cases is that the partner begins to feel pressure they cannot fully explain. They start to sense that their normal behavior is being monitored for emotional feedback, and that changes the natural flow of the relationship. I remember a pattern I've seen where someone would constantly seek reassurance in subtle ways, not always directly asking for it, but fishing for it through questions, messages, or emotional signals. And even when reassurance was given, it never lasted long, because the real issue was not the lack of reassurance, it was the dependency on it. The mind that depends on validation will always find a reason to question it again. What many people don't realize is that validation is not meant to be a constant supply that keeps you stable. It is meant to be a shared expression, not a foundation for self-worth. When you begin to look at your partner as the primary source of emotional confirmation, you slowly remove your own internal grounding. And in relationships, that creates imbalance because attraction and respect are deeply influenced by emotional independence. I've seen people transform their relationships simply by shifting this pattern, not by becoming distant, but by becoming internally steady. Instead of waiting for approval, they begin to trust their own judgment. Instead of reading every response for hidden meaning, they start focusing on the actual content of communication. And over time, something interesting happens. The relationship becomes lighter, communication becomes clearer, and the emotional pressure reduces because one person is no longer carrying the responsibility of constantly validating the other's worth. 7. Allowing disrespect to pass without addressing it. When I talk about allowing disrespect to pass without addressing it, I'm referring to a pattern I've seen in relationships where small moments of disregard are ignored so often that they eventually become the foundation of how the relationship functions. Imagine a man in a relationship who notices something said to him that feels dismissive or a tone that crosses a line of respect, but instead of addressing it, he tells himself it's not worth the tension. He lets it go once, then twice, then many times after that. At first, it feels like maturity. He may even believe he is being calm, choosing peace over conflict. But over time, what actually happens is not peace. It is quiet acceptance of behavior that slowly lowers how he is treated. In my experience observing relationship dynamics, I've seen that respect is not only built by what you demand, but also by what you consistently tolerate. When disrespect is not acknowledged, it doesn't correct itself. It adapts. It becomes more comfortable appearing in slightly bigger forms because there was no boundary set at the smaller ones. I remember situations I've observed where someone would laugh off comments that made them uncomfortable or stay silent when their partner spoke to them in a way that didn't align with mutual respect. And because nothing was ever addressed, the behavior became normalized. The partner did not necessarily intend harm, but without feedback, there is no awareness of limits. And this is where many people misunderstand relationships. Silence is often interpreted as acceptance. What you don't correct becomes what you allow. Over time, the person on the receiving end of that silence starts to feel less careful with their words, not out of cruelty, but out of conditioning. Human behavior adjusts to patterns, and when there is no signal that something is unacceptable, the line gradually shifts. I've seen individuals reach a point where they finally express frustration, but by then the dynamic has already been shaped by months or even years of unspoken acceptance. And at that stage, the conversation feels heavier, because it is no longer about one incident, it is about a pattern that was never interrupted. What makes this especially important in relationships is that addressing disrespect is not about creating conflict. It is about creating clarity. When something feels wrong and you communicate it calmly, you are not attacking the relationship, you are defining its boundaries. I've worked with people who feared that speaking up would push their partner away, only to realize later that the real issue was not the conversation itself, but the accumulation of everything they never said. When you consistently allow things that do not align with your standards to pass without acknowledgement, you slowly train yourself to become smaller in your own relationship. But when you begin to address things early, with calm and clarity, something shifts. Respect becomes easier to maintain because both people understand where the lines are, and the relationship stops relying on assumption and starts relying on communication. In the end, everything we've discussed comes down to one simple idea. Respect in a relationship is not demanded. It is reflected in your behavior, your consistency, and your self-awareness. It is shaped by what you tolerate, how you communicate, and whether you stay grounded in your own values while connecting with someone else. When you stop over-explaining, chasing attention, ignoring boundaries, reacting emotionally, seeking constant validation, lowering your standards, and tolerating disrespect, you don't just change how others treat you, you change how you show up in your own life. And that shift is where real respect naturally begins to grow.